You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Past Macabre, where we journey through history to uncover how our relationship with death reflects the values, fears, and hopes that shape the way people live. I'm your host, Stephanie Rice. Thank you for joining me for episode 22, Sunken Cities Part 1, New Discoveries from the Ancient Egyptian Port Canopus. The next few episodes will be a mini-series about sunken cities, as the name alludes to, and thanks to the recent finds announced from Egypt, Canopus is the perfect sunken city to start with. At the end of August, Egyptian authorities announced the results of a successful mission to lift several artifacts from the city of Canopus, which is just offshore from Alexandria. In this episode, I'll share info about these latest artifacts, as well as some of the other artifacts that have been brought to the surface and a lot of the geological surveys that have been done around this area in order to try to understand what caused Canopus to sink. According to Greek and Roman writers, the city was founded by the mythical king Menelaus from Homer's Iliad, but these artifacts can actually help us learn the true timeline of Canopus. What we know is that Canopus was a main trade hub for moving goods between the maritime trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea, up the Nile, and further into Egypt. It sat on what was known as the Canopic branch of the Nile, which in the delta, the Nile fans out. And so you have to have these canals or branches that are navigable by boats rather than some of the smaller ones. And the Canopic branch was the most navigable at the time. Thanks to it being such a major trade hub, it can tell us a lot about the relationship between Egypt and the wider region. Canopus was also a sacred site, and here there was a unique form of Osiris that was worshipped called Osiris Hydrios by the Greeks. It means Osiris of the waters. He was depicted as a human-headed jar, which it was intended that this jar was filled with healing waters, but it was also in the shape of the embalming jars that ancient Egypt used. It's thanks to this form of Osiris that the embalming jars are now called canopic jars by us in the modern times. The healing waters that were associated with Osiris Hydrios also brought people from all over the ancient world, and the tradition even carried on into the Christian period. The Osiris cult here became important to the Ptolemies once they took over Egypt, and they established the Mysteries of Osiris, which was an annual chthonic ritual that incorporated Greek mystery cults like the Eleusinian Mysteries or the Dionysian Mysteries with ancient Egyptian beliefs. In parallel, the Ptolemies also established the Serapeum here, which was a major temple dedicated to Serapis, who was a syncretic mix of Osiris, the Apis bull, and little attributes from various Greek gods. It was very important during the Ptolemaic period to merge these Egyptian beliefs and iconography with Greek beliefs and iconography in order to reconcile with legitimizing their rule to the native Egyptians without ostracizing the Greeks who were going to move into the area or be trading more heavily with Egypt as well. And geological surveys that are done alongside the underwater archaeology here are also helping us to understand what caused Canopus to sink. Because understanding what happened here isn't just about the past. While obviously as an archaeologist, I do love studying the past. But the reason we study the past is because it can also inform us about the future as well. Without intervention, Alexandria may face the same fate as Canopus by 2050. Now, understanding how people of the past adapted to disasters could help us find solutions for today's climate-threatened coastal cities, believe it or not. There's evidence here at Canopus of attempts to actually mitigate some of the disasters that they were facing, and there was no single destruction event here. Canopus actually sank with a combination of major disasters and a slow sinking over centuries. Now let's dive in, pun totally intended, to the artifacts, myths, and history of Canopus. Just a couple of weeks ago, the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities announced that there had been a successful mission for an underwater archaeology project to remove a bunch of artifacts from the sunken city of Canopus, which is near Alexandria in the Mediterranean Sea. The finds included a granite Ptolemaic statue. It's unclear who it was meant to be because of the damage that was done, but archaeologists are going to, of course, be looking into it and trying to identify them. A white marble Roman statue. Again, it's unclear if this was meant to be a god or an emperor or Roman statesman, but as research is done, we'll be able to know, hopefully. There were also fragments of a merchant ship that had been carrying almonds and walnuts and a copper measuring scale that was really unique to this area during this period. So archaeologists pulled up some samples so that they can study more of it. And there was also pieces of buildings and reservoirs that they took up in order to study like the materials and exactly what these were made of. And these reservoirs were built in order to store water and raise fish. So at the time they would have been above sea level, just ever so slightly, and then they would have gone down into the waters. So this can also tell us about the water levels during the different periods when these were built. Lots of coins and potsherds were brought up, as is usual for pretty much any underwater archaeology project that involves any amount of coins. The easiest way for archaeologists to date things is through coins. Whenever we do any sort of like carbon dating, that's going to have a wide range of error. It is getting more narrow as technology gets better, but when it comes to coins, a lot of them are specifically stamped with a date, or they were only minted during certain periods. And so that can help us narrow things down even more than carbon dating could. So we could get a window with carbon dating that can then become a much, much smaller snapshot with these coins. So hopefully they yield a bunch more information than what we already have. One of the most intriguing things that was pulled up is a quartz sphinx that has the name of Ramses II in a cartouche. And that's the oval shape that is around royal names and the names of deities to denote that these are special names. And Ramses ruled during the New Kingdom during the 19th dynasty. And so this sphinx creates a potential new timeline than what archaeologists previously knew when it came to the timeline of Canopus. As far as we already knew, was established during the late period of Egypt's history. And if there was actually any 19th dynasty activity here, that would be wonderful news to be able to push the date back even further and find potentially more evidence. But the caveat is many Egyptian leaders were prone to utilizing the monuments of their predecessors in order to proclaim their legitimacy. So it might be that Sphinx is only there because another ruler brought it in order to honor this place and honor Ramses, who even, like, we know Ramses II as Ramses the Great. And even in ancient times, he was incredibly famous and well known because he had such a lasting impact on Egypt's history. He ruled for the longest, maybe second longest, but I'm pretty sure the longest out of any of the pharaohs in Egypt's history. And quite a few military campaigns, trade alliances, very interesting texts that provide more information about the region. A lot of that comes from his reign. So again, it would be very, very common for a pharaoh who came later to want to connect to such a famous ruler, and therefore bringing that Sphinx here would help kind of add to their legitimacy of whatever they built at the site as well. But that's not discounting the fact that maybe there actually was New Kingdom activity actually here. Only time will tell. These artifacts are obviously of great archaeological importance and historical importance because studying Canopus and all of the artifacts from it help us to piece together the true timeline of the city. And instead of what we know just purely from Greek and Roman texts about it previously. But also there's the factor that the city sank due to climate catastrophes and climate change over time. And we can learn from sites like this in the ancient world and see what people did or didn't do in order to either successfully or not successfully adapt in their environments, which are right next door to our current threatened environments. Alexandria, for example, is only 12 kilometers away, the core of it. The actual suburban sprawl of Alexandria essentially covers what is left of Canopus on the surface, the very, very last little remnant. So it's already threatened. Alexandria has already experienced massive flooding and a lot of sea level rise already. And if nothing is done, it's going to be the next sunken city in the Mediterranean. The United Nations predicted in their best case scenario that a third of Alexandria will be underwater or uninhabitable by 2050. That's only 25 years away. And that's just based on the current sea level rise rate. That's not factoring in any sort of sudden emergencies that could come, like earthquakes or tsunamis. Alexandria is known as the Pearl of the Mediterranean coast now, but for centuries, Canopus was Egypt's cosmopolitan connection to the Mediterranean Sea trade networks. It was along the most navigable branch of the Nile Delta region, which is where the Nile fans out into many different branches that change over time depending on how the sediment is. And the Canopic branch, as it was known, was the largest and most stable and able to get shipping in from the Mediterranean Sea into the Nile so that it could go down. And therefore, it would be essentially the most important pit stop in between any trade network between Egypt and the wider oceanic trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Aegean and beyond. Canopus survived many disasters before it sank into the sea, and that's possibly because it was important enough to protect and repair. There's evidence that I'll go into later that during a seismic event, not a huge earthquake, but enough to cause damage, there was actually patchwork done around foundations in order to attempt to repair, and those buildings did continue to be in use for centuries after the evidence of when that earthquake was. So again, I'll get into that later, but these sorts of things show that it was important enough to spend the time and resources on, and therefore there are likely things we can learn from. Archaeology here gives us information about trade goods and ideas and beliefs that were exchanged with the different culture groups that all came together across the Mediterranean Sea trade routes. And it also shows us what the kings of Egypt wanted others to perceive Egypt as during their rule. And these can all inform us about political and economic relationships that Egypt had with the wider region, as well as what was going on internally at the time. Canopus now is about 5 to 7 meters or 16 to 22 feet below the surface, depending on which part of the city that you're in. There wasn't a single event that caused Canopus to sink. It was actually a series of events. And that's another reason why it makes it a unique case study compared to the many examples of single destruction events that have happened at other cities across the Mediterranean region. So again, we can always learn from both the successes and the failures, but we don't have as many examples of the successes in the archaeological record, at least that we've found so far. Because the problem is the cities that have successfully stayed, the coastal cities that have successfully stayed above sea level despite being threatened, are also now home to modern cities that can't all be excavated up. People's homes and businesses are there. So there's always that trouble of how do you see the success story when you can't get to the one that's still standing? So one of the things to look at here at Canopus is to figure out if it was actually intentional mitigation efforts that was the reason for the success story for so long, or if it was just sheer dumb luck that they managed to scrape by several major disasters before it finally sank. And so that's one of the things that archaeologists have been working really hard to try to uncover, not just the artifacts of the place, but also the geological history of the place. And that's why they would choose to bring up a bunch of building stones and try to study exactly like which type of stone they were used or what sizes they were and things of that nature. All sorts of little details are documented because you never know what the important details are when you're first looking at it. I hope that makes sense. But essentially, if you're going at this with the question of how did this help, you just want to document everything as possible until you can start narrowing it down more and more. Several geophysical survey methods, historical records like texts from Roman, Greek, and all sorts of other people from all over the Mediterranean region referencing things happening during the period, and the archaeological record have been combined, and that's starting to help the researchers piece together what happened with Canopus over time. It's not perfect, obviously. These are all fairly new results that are being worked with, and there's more and more to be found as more of the sites are uncovered. But from a broad overview, there's a couple of fairly glaringly obvious issues for Canopus that are being looked into how they were dealt with. And the first and largest problem is that it was built at most 2 meters or about 6.5 feet above sea level. And that's at most. There were other parts similar to modern day Alexandria that are at sea level or just 1 meter above sea level. And so again, when you're in an area that is created by the annual flooding of the Nile, you're going to have those water levels rise every year that the Nile floods. And while they're used to it, obviously this is something that happens to them every single year. It's not going to become a surprise all of a sudden and a major disaster. There's times when there are going to be changes in the flooding levels. So excessively high inundation periods would cause quite a lot of damage to the buildings that they might not have been expecting, or even the foundations around the buildings. And I guess luckily that's not a modern threat from the Nile, at least, because the Aswan Dam, it was built in 1970, and ever since then there is no more Nile flooding. That was ultimately the point, because the Nile floods were very devastating to the way that all of the modern cities were set up, and so it has definitely helped a lot. But the Mediterranean is still a bit of a threat because it's got some pretty bad storms that can have surges over 5 meters or 16 feet on average. There are much larger recorded storm surges that have happened, specifically at Alexandria. And I'm going to keep using that as the baseline because obviously it's the next door neighbor of Canopus. It's still above water mostly, but obviously, as I mentioned before, it's kind of the one to watch to make sure that it's not going to suffer the same fate as Canopus. Gradual sea level rise over centuries also played a role in how Canopus sank. So again, it wasn't just all one massive event, and there was a slower amount to it happening as well. But the problem is, based on several different samples that have been taken throughout the Mediterranean region, during the period that Canopus was most likely to have been most active, which would have been roughly 500 BCE to the 8th century CE. I'll get into the exact date later as we finish going through its timeline, but the sea level was only rising an average of 1.7 millimeters per year back then. And now, over the last 30 years, the Mediterranean Sea has been rising at an average of 2.8 millimeters per year, and that's been increasing with each year. So it's far more likely that very, very quickly that will be a much bigger issue than it was for Canopus. The next major problem that Canopus faced was the fact that the Nile Delta is a constantly shifting landscape, as I alluded to before, with saying that the Canopic branch was the most navigable during that period. The way that the Nile floods happen, it dumps a lot of sediment, every year. And so that builds up, and within a fairly short period, a new island can be created, or one that was previously there could be washed away. There's all sorts of changes that go on just at the surface level of all of the land that's within the Nile Delta. But because it's all just deposits of fresh sediment, that also impacts the lower parts of the ground and not just the surface. So the soil that's in this area won't have had any time to compact at all yet, like soil in most other areas does. It's pretty much going to still be a lot of moisture and air between the different particles. And so this makes it very unstable ground. Like a pretty simple example would be when you just build a sandcastle and you don't pack it down. Like if you go to the beach and you're trying to build a solid sandcastle, you're going to make your little walls and your little towers, and you're going to pack the sand so that it is sturdier. And if you just keep piling very loose sand, it's going to end up essentially just being a mound of sand and very quickly lose its shape or not be able to hold any sort of shape after a certain height. So ultimately, think of that, but on a much larger scale when it comes to the entire land mass of the Nile Delta area. Now, another good thing that modern times have going for us is that is a bit less of a construction problem than it was back then, because now we know and we have the tools to make sure that we can build much deeper and basically like anchor buildings in past the sediment. But they did it to some extent in ancient Egypt, but not on the scale that we do it today. And most especially, they didn't account for when you have extra heavy buildings, such as incredibly large temples with massive stone blocks, and their entire foundation is on such shifting sands that can shift in multiple directions, not just all at once. The foundation ruins at Canopus that are underwater now are huge. So they definitely would have been putting a lot of pressure onto this unstable ground that it was not able to handle with repeated seismic activity over centuries. Another major factor for pretty much any Mediterranean coastal city is that the Mediterranean area is very seismically active. It's where the African and Eurasian tectonic plates meet. And because of the nature of how they meet, there's actually pretty much every type of active fault line that you can get. There's strike slip faults, reverse faults, and normal faults. And this causes quite a lot of land transformation and seismic activity, specifically within the Mediterranean basin. And because of the nature of most of these faults, they often trigger tsunamis whenever there are earthquakes there, and they're under the water of the Mediterranean Sea. A very well-documented example would be that on July 21st, 365 CE, there was an 8.5 magnitude earthquake off the coast of Crete that caused a tsunami that devastated Alexandria and the surrounding area. For context on the size of that, the major earthquake of San Francisco that happened in 1906 that also caused major fires and a tsunami was a 7.9. And this one, based on most of the evidence that has been gathered from like textual reports and geological samples, this would have been an 8.5 magnitude that had happened. So definitely devastating. That earthquake and tsunami did actually sink parts of Alexandria in that single disaster event, specifically the royal quarter of Alexandria that used to be there. And there's also a theory that might be why nobody has found the tomb of Alexander the Great or Cleopatra yet, because supposedly the location of where the main necropolis for the Ptolemies would have been was also in the part of Alexandria that sank due to that earthquake. We don't know for sure. It's just a theory. And again, we don't even know the location of the necropolis or if it was real. It's one of those things that comes from ancient texts. But the point is, massive devastation, and a lot of Alexandria's history was already lost through that. And so with what we know today of Alexandria and how it has continued to thrive after that, we can understand how Canopus was able to continue after this as well, because that was not the event that took Canopus off the map. One of the coolest geologically related finds out of Canopus, in my opinion, is the fact that the underwater archaeology team found a man-made repair at a fault scarp, which is, I guess, essentially an earthquake scar, to put it like very simply. It's where an earthquake caused a sudden jutting up of a piece of the land. So now where there wasn't a cliff, there now is, or a crevice in some cases, depending on which direction the plates were scraping in, essentially. And so here at this fault scarp, it was near the foundation of several buildings in East Canopus. And so clearly the people who lived here, worked here, etc., they didn't want to lose their buildings. And what's very cool is the fault scarp crevice and leading up towards the little mini cliff, it's been lined with matting and then filled in with sand and then covered with more materials and matting, like a tarp, essentially. And so obviously they had some sort of experience in dealing with this. It wasn't like somebody just on a wild hair was like, let's make a bunch of mats and put them in the ocean, and everybody went with it. It is also likely that this happened when this part of Canopus was still above ground, including like where the fault scarp is, and not just the foundations that are slightly above it. So they clearly managed to protect this area for quite a while. There were actually animal bones found within the filler sand within the fault scarp that date to the 1st century CE. So even if that animal wasn't like actively killed right then and there for some sort of sacrifice or whatever, and it was just animal bones that just got mixed in with the rocks or whatever, it at least allows a rough estimated date to be put on when this repair happened. So we know that this massive destructive earthquake and tsunami happened several centuries later, and Canopus was still able to survive even after that. I'll get into the text evidence of its continued existence after this, but I just think that's very cool because there was a level of innovation there. Obviously, more studies will need to be done to see how much that Band-Aid essentially actually, well, I feel like that is too condescending. That is such a complex thing, but it's essentially just a fix of the damage that was done to the earth. So a Band-Aid for the earth, I guess. And I think it's just very cool that it potentially actually withstood another earthquake and managed to keep those foundations up higher for longer. But again, more tests will need to be done. There will need to be more studies on like trying to pinpoint the timing of when the different pieces of the city sank and compare it to when that was built and other disasters. But again, it's still a very cool start, and there's so much more data to go through from Canopus. Seismic activity and then a layer of freshly deposited sediment being pretty much the only ground there was the perfect storm for another major threat that Canopus faced. This thing called soil liquefaction, which is probably the most accurately described geological process ever, in that it is literally when the soil behaves like a liquid. The core reason for it is when loose soil has sudden and intense stress put on it, like the ground shaking during an earthquake, for one example, it becomes unstable and flows essentially like water and can cause things to sink. Quicksand is the most widely known form of soil liquefaction, even though it's sand. Sometimes it's just called ground liquefaction because of sand and clay also being factored in. And the main difference between quicksand and what happened to Canopus is that quicksand is generally caused by water flowing underneath it and causing the friction that way. And the larger liquefaction event that Canopus would have experienced was caused by seismic activity. There's evidence of multiple periods when soil liquefaction happened at Canopus, but during the 2nd century BCE, a pretty major event happened, and parts of the eastern suburbs of Canopus were lost, specifically due to soil liquefaction, based on the evidence around the buildings that remained there and the seafloor. Now, this was a sudden destruction event, and it didn't take out the entire city, but the portions of the suburb that were taken out had very clearly zero time to evacuate, or at the very least, zero time to go back for valuables, due to the nature of anything sinking underwater and all sorts of processes. It's not very likely that bodies will be found if they were there to begin with. And as far as I know, there weren't any found in this area, but there were very valuable items. So that shows that it was very quick and it was already sank right after the event so that people couldn't go back in and try to grab anything from the rubble. On top of that, there's nothing else in this destruction layer from any other period after the 2nd century. That's why it's been able to be dated instead of the larger geological time frame that would have been done just based off of the geological tests done. And there's still tons of archaeological evidence and text evidence that Canopus survived after this, like the majority of Canopus, and continued on for centuries. And again, it withstood many different soil liquefaction events and earthquakes and tsunamis. So it managed to tough it out for quite a while, but the elements were against it and eventually won. I know this has been a bit of an info dump, so we'll stop here for this episode. Thank you for listening to all of these geological processes and information on the latest artifacts that have been lifted up from the Mediterranean Sea at the ancient site of Canopus. In the next episode, we'll explore the mythological origins of Canopus and what these latest and the previously found artifacts tell us about the factual history of Canopus. What we do know is that it was popular from at least the 30th dynasty until it completely sank in the 8th century CE. So now, with each artifact that's pulled up, we can get an even closer look at the different periods that fall within that time frame. So I can't wait to explore what we know so far with you. Until next time.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe to keep up with new releases. Please leave a rating and a comment. That helps the show reach others who may be interested in the past macabre. For access to bonus content from all Archaeology Podcast Network shows, become a member at archpodnet.com/members. That's archpodnet.com/members. You can find show notes for this and other episodes at archpodnet.com/TPM and follow Past Macabre on Instagram. That's PAST_MACABRE. You'll find pictures of the sites and artifacts discussed, Q&A sessions, and episode topic votes. Hope to see you there.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is 10 years old this year. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy, our social media coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht, and our chief editor is Rachel Roden. The Archaeology Podcast Network was co-founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in 2014 and is part of Cultural Media and DigTech LLC.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.